please welcome Joel Sipress. I'll try to crank this up gradually.
Well, thanks for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be here. And I do teach for a living, so I'm used to talking to big groups of people. So can everyone hear me just like this? Great. I see Cruz and Joe in the back saying yeah, so that means we're good. I appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak on a really, really timely topic, which is the history of economic inequality under capitalism. And I was chatting with Charles Gessert, who I think you all probably know, who's the one who extended the invitation to me. And he suggested to me to just share that these remarks were prepared before I knew that the Senate would pass an abomination of a tax bill. So I think these comments are really timely, but that's by coincidence. And maybe towards the end we can have a little bit of discussion of that tax bill, because I think the comments I'm going to share today are going to make us realize that that particular bill is even more hideous than many people already realize. But I'm mainly here to spare you from having to read this book. In 2013, a French economist named Thomas Piketty published a book called Capital in the 21st Century. It's this 600-page tome filled with incredibly dense economic analysis that remarkably went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, something that books like this never do. And I'm just curious, has anyone here heard of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital?
Read it.
All right, how many people purchased a copy? Now, I want you to be honest. Of those who purchased a copy, how many of you read it? How many of you finished it? Congratulations. This is a book that I think way more people heard of than purchased, and way more people purchased it than read it, and way more people started it than finished it. It is really, really dense stuff, but it's really important. I think the reason it went to the top of the bestsellers list is it spoke to a concern that has been growing in recent years, which is the facts right in front of us show us that we're living through a time of greater and greater economic inequality, not just in this country, but in countries around the world. And when you get an economist doing significant research to try to explain why that is and what we might be able to do about it, there's interest in that. And then people went and grabbed the book and they started reading and they're like, right? So here's what I want to do. I want to just basically present to you the argument of this book as a spark to conversation. So I think what I'm going to do is just kind of run through Piketty's book, what he's setting out to do, what his approach is, what his conclusions are, then throw it open for some discussion and some questions, and then I'll have a few remarks about kind of the implications of this and what we're to make of it. So, Piketty, French economist, Capital in the 21st Century. The book is designed to address the question of the distribution of wealth under capitalism. That's what this whole book is about. It's a study of the distribution of wealth under capitalism. And by capitalism, he just means, and I just mean, the economic system produced by the Industrial Revolution. That's the sense in which I'll be using the word capitalism, the sense in which he uses the word capitalism, our modern industrial economy, an economy that was produced by the Industrial Revolution. And ever since the dawn of industrialization, there's been a big debate over this issue of the distribution of wealth under capitalism. To what degree does capitalism as a system systematically produce inequalities? And there are traditionally a few different camps on that question. There are those I'll refer to as kind of conservative free market economists whose answer to that question is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters is that this modern industrial system produces enormous amounts of wealth and does it in a way that raises everybody's living standards. And because it raises everybody's living standards, the distribution of those benefits doesn't matter. It's not even a question worth asking. What matters is that we have a system that allows human beings to live a quality of life and a standard of living that would have been unimaginable even to the wealthy of the pre-industrial age, and therefore we shouldn't worry about how that pie gets divided up because that really is just about jealousy. So it's an unimportant question. What matters is the growth of the economy, the growing productivity of human beings. That's what we should focus on. So that's sort of been the traditional conservative free market position. Issues of distribution really don't matter since a rising tide lifts all boats. Early in the Industrial Revolution, you got the famous economist, sociologist, philosopher Karl Marx, who was one of the early critics of capitalism, whose argument was that capitalism, the wealth of capitalism is actually produced through exploitation. That at the heart of this system is the exploitation of workers who produce the wealth and the owners of industry who gain most of the benefits. And so living through the early years of the Industrial Revolution, which, I think we're all familiar with the horrific working conditions and the immiseration of working people, and he sort of saw that as systematic and central to capitalism. And he predicted that those inequalities would become so great as wealth became more and more concentrated, that at a certain point the system would essentially blow itself up, either because it would become economically unsustainable, or because the working people who produce the wealth would reach a point where they wouldn't tolerate it anymore, and they would simply overthrow that ruling class that exploited them. And that view of capitalism became very, very influential, of course, and helped inspire a lot of the labor movements and working class movements around the world that challenged that economic system. Something interesting happened in the United States and in certain other parts of the world, particularly Europe, Japan, Australia. In the period after World War II, all of a sudden it seemed as though these economic inequalities were growing smaller. And in fact, after generations of kind of this huge gap between workers and employers, the system seemed to have reached a point in which workers were now seeming to benefit in proportion to the growth in the economy. That after witnessing the creation of these huge gaps of wealth and poverty during the Industrial Revolution, we've reached a point where now we can say a rising tide really is lifting all boats. And you kind of get what I would say became the dominant view in the United States, the dominant view in Western Europe, that goes something like this. The Industrial Revolution in its early phases produced enormous inequalities. But as this industrial system matured, as we learned how to subject it to proper regulation, as workers came to develop unions, that the system matured to a point where the benefits began to become more evenly spread. And it was sort of like, I would say, a vision of history that said that we had to go through this terrible phase of early industrialization in order to arrive at the golden age where now everyone is really benefiting from that system and the wealth it produces. There was a very prominent economist named Kuznets who famously came up with a model where he described kind of the history of capitalism as an inverted U. That the U, the line refers to the distribution of wealth. In the early phase of industrialization, you see growing inequality, then you reach the top of the U, and as the industrial system and capitalism matures, you then see declining inequality. He actually did some empirical research, largely in the United States, and looked at the history of economic inequality in the United States, and writing in the 1950s, he said, wow, we actually have empirical data to show that in the United States, the early phase of industrialization produced great inequalities, and now in recent years, those inequalities are narrowing. And he then sort of generalized that and proposed that as kind of a universal law of capitalism. And I'd say from the 50s up through the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, that was kind of the conventional wisdom. That was conventional wisdom. And that's kind of the way I grew up. I mean, all four of my grandparents were born in Europe, came to the United States as immigrants, went through the really rough times that I know a lot of our families went through when they came to this country. My grandfather worked in the clothing industry in New York. And kind of my family history was a history of, My grandparents came here, they struggled through the hard times, and now I am gaining the benefits of what that generation of working people went through, and the struggles they fought to make sure that we could all benefit from this system. And I mean, that's kind of the way I grew up. That was kind of my view of the world. Things used to be really, really bad, and thank goodness my grandparents' generation fought really hard to make sure that all of us could share in those benefits. And Kuznets was sort of the economic researcher and theorist who came up with the theory that kind of put economic stamp of approval on that story. Well, that story began to unravel in the last 20, 30 years in this country and around the world as people began to notice that the gap between the wealthy and basically everyone else was beginning to grow again. And into that jumps this French economist, Thomas Piketty, who says, we got to figure out what's going on. We got to figure out what's going on. We need to understand whether is this an issue that capitalism systematically produces these kinds of inequities, or is this just a phase of history? Is it a pendulum? What's going on? We need to systematically study the history of wealth inequality under capitalism and figure out what's going on. And so he went about it in a particular way. And being freethinkers, I think you'll find his method interesting. His method was what is sometimes called empiricism. Empiricism. Let's gather a whole lot of data and draw conclusions from the data. And you might be saying, well, that's common sense, right? Isn't that what scholars always do and researchers always do? You gather data and then you draw conclusions about what's going on from the data. Well, in fact, in a lot of corners of the economics profession, that's not how it's done. It's not how it's done. Particularly in this country, in the United States, the most prominent economists, the most influential economists, the most renowned economists in this country are the modelers, the economic modelers, the people who basically do this. We're going to make some assumptions about human behavior, and then based on those assumptions, we're going to build economic models that will predict how the economy will work. That's a different approach from empiricism. Empiricism is you gather data and then you build a model that explains your data. In this country, the most prominent economists tend to fall into the camp that says, let's make reasonable assumptions about how people are and behave, and then let's build models based on that. And surprisingly, a lot of these models don't get subjected to particularly rigorous empirical testing. And the economists who do empirical testing of these kind of models often tend to be the people who are considered in the backwaters of the profession. The really prominent economists are the ones who spin these beautiful economic models, and then kind of your middling economists are the ones who write papers about whether they actually explain anything that the prominent economists often ignore and keep spinning their models. And I'll give you one example of that, not from Piketty, it's a really interesting example. The assertion that there's a trade-off between wages and employment. I bet you've heard this. How many times have you heard people say, if we raise the minimum wage, it's going to cost jobs? Who's ever heard somebody say that? If we raise the minimum wage, it's going to cost jobs. That was basically Econ 101. It was in textbooks. It was taught to generations of economics students. And economists would say, we're not making a value judgment. You know, policymakers have to make a judgment between wages and jobs. And it's up to policymakers, because that's a value decision. But we as economists are telling you there is a trade-off between raising the minimum wage and costing jobs. And that was taught and asserted by the economics profession based on modeling, but it was never actually subjected to rigorous empirical scrutiny. Until the 1990s, when a couple of economists did a study. New Jersey raised their state minimum wage. New Jersey is next door to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania didn't raise their state minimum wage, so they had the perfect experiment. And they said, is there any evidence that New Jersey modestly raising their minimum wage above Pennsylvania's, did that cost New Jersey jobs? And they found no empirical evidence that a modest increase in New Jersey's minimum wage cost New Jersey jobs. So the empirical evidence is at odds with the theory, the model. Now, good research isn't based on one study, so that should have inspired all sorts of people to go out and try to replicate that study to see if they had the same findings, right? Well, no, there have been very few empirical studies of the impact of minimum wage hikes on employment. That's, one of the studies we have. But guess what? You can still go into economics classrooms all over this country and open up economics textbooks that will say as a fact there's a trade-off between wages and jobs. And it's not based on empirical research. So Piketty said, I'm going to do this based on empirical research. Before I theorize about the distribution of wealth under capitalism, I'm going to study it. I'm going to get my hands on data. And there's all sorts of data out there. I mean, governments are really, really, really good at generating information about the economy. So there's all this data out there from countries all over the world, but it had never really been organized and systematically studied. So a big chunk of his book is just collecting this massive amount of data on the history of wealth distribution. And I'm going to emphasize, he's not talking about income distribution. Income distribution is the distribution of people's earnings. He's focusing on wealth distribution, the distribution of what people own. Money, property, stocks and bonds, all that stuff. And he came up with a really interesting empirical finding that can be summed up like this. Except for the period after World War II, except for the couple decades after World War II, the trend in every country has been towards greater concentration of wealth. So prior to World War II, the trend ever since the Industrial Revolution in every country you looked at was towards a greater concentration of wealth. And then you get a period for a couple of decades after World War II where the concentration of wealth narrowed in many countries. And then after a couple decades, you return to the earlier pattern of a growing concentration of wealth. He said that's what the empirical data finds. So that's the first thing he did. So now we've got a finding. We've got an empirical finding that needs to be explained. It needs to be explained. And that's when he begins building his model, his economic model, to explain what he observed from the data. And his model is actually pretty simple. It's pretty simple, and it takes him hundreds of pages to present it. But once you get what he's saying, I actually boiled it down to a paragraph for a review of this book I once wrote for actually the Hillsider newspaper here in Duluth, because I wanted to save the readers of the Hillsider from having to read 600 pages. And I was able to boil down his model to like one paragraph. I'm just going to read you this. He concludes that the reason that modern industrial capitalism produces such great inequalities in wealth is that investment income tends to grow more quickly than the overall growth in the economy. Investment income tends to grow more quickly than the overall growth of the economy. So let me elaborate on that a little bit. For most of us, our income comes mainly from wages and salaries. For most people, your income comes from the money we receive from employers in exchange for our labor. That's how most people earn all or virtually all of their income. But there's a second way to earn income, and that's investment income. Investment income is money that's earned through the ownership of property. And that can take a lot of forms. It can take the form of income you earn from stocks, bonds, real estate, income you earn by virtue of the fact that you own property. That's called investment income. And it can take a lot of forms. Dividends. If you own stocks, your dividends are a form of investment income. Interest payments. Whether it's the interest you get on a CD or the interest you get on a government bond or the interest you get on a corporate bond. Investment income, dividends and interest is a form of investment income. Capital gains. Capital gains is a form of investment income. Rent on that you get from owning real estate is a form of investment income. So investment income is income that you earn from ownership. Most people in this country have essentially zero investment income of any sort. Some people might have a savings account or a checking account where you get a tiny bit of interest, especially with interest rates as low as they are. You might own a house, and then when you sell your house, you might get a little bit of capital gains out of selling your house. But the vast majority of people their income is mainly from their labor. So you think about this. Two kinds of way of earning money, labor and investments. And what Piketty found, and this actually shouldn't surprise us, is that investment income tends to grow more rapidly than the economy as a whole. Investment income tends to grow more rapidly than the economy as a whole. So particularly in what I'll call the mature, developed capitalist economies, in good times, economic growth runs like about 2%. The economy grows at about 2% a year. A really good year, you can get like 3% growth. That's about how quickly the economy grows. But people who have large amounts of investment property are not satisfied with 2 or 3% rate of return. And so if you average out all the returns on all investment income, maybe you're looking more at like 4 or 5% annually. So if the economy grows at 2 or 3% a year and people get a 4 or 5% return on their investment income, people who own investment property are going to see their incomes grow more rapidly than the growth of the economy. And he takes about 400 pages to make that case. But when you step back and you think about it, that's just it makes sense, right? It just makes sense. Look at people who own a lot of stocks and bonds and a lot of real estate and a lot of capital gains. They're not settling for 2 or 3% rate of return each year. And now the key thing is that this wouldn't be a big deal if property was evenly distributed across the population, right? But we know property is concentrated. Property is concentrated. A lot of people don't own any property at all to speak of. A lot of people own a home and maybe have some modest savings for retirement. And then there are relatively few people who own a lot of property. There are relatively few people who own a lot of property. And if property ownership is concentrated, and if the return on investment is larger than the annual growth in the economy, then the people who own property are going to end up every year owning a greater and greater share of the wealth of the country. So if property ownership is concentrated and if investment income grows more rapidly than the rate of economic growth, the result is that you will have a tendency over time to have wealth increasingly concentrated. So that leads him to a conclusion. And his conclusion is that it's the natural tendency of modern capitalist economies to produce ever greater levels of inequality. Notice he said that it's a tendency. It's the natural tendency. There are exceptions to that rule. It's a tendency. The system has a tendency to concentrate wealth at greater and greater levels. And as I said, there are exceptions. The post-World War II period is an exception. And he essentially labels the post-World War II era as an exception. He emphasizes that it's an exception because World War II was hugely destructive of people's fortunes. I mean, to put it really bluntly, rich people lost a lot of their wealth in World War II because of the devastation of that war, particularly in Europe. And World War II wiped out a lot of the traditional old money fortunes of Europe. And I think you would add to that, he touches on this too, but you could also, I think, add to that the economic and political disruptions of the Great Depression followed by the war also created a climate where public policy was put in place that redistributed income. Because he emphasizes that you can have government interventions to spread wealth around. So, for example, think of this country. How did the United States finance World War II? Well, part of it was by borrowing a lot of money through bonds. But the other way this country financed World War II is they jacked the income tax way, 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 way up. Because they had to pay for the war. And the income tax remained jacked way, way, way up for people with very high incomes right through the 50s, the Eisenhower era, and it's really only starting under Kennedy in the 60s that they begin significantly ratcheting down those very high tax brackets that were put in place during World War II to pay for the war. So the just sheer economic devastation of the war and the economic and social and political dislocations of the war kind of countered that general tendency towards concentration of wealth. So here's Kuznets in the 1950s looking at that, what Piketty concludes is a short-term trend, an exception to the general tendency. You know, Kuznets is in the 50s saying, wow, look at it. Back in the old days, capitalism created these vast inequalities. We've now got a new and improved, mature, better capitalism that spreads the wealth around. That became the conventional wisdom, not just among economists, but among most people in the public at large. And me growing up as a kid in the 1970s, heard all these family stories about the struggles my grandparents went through to help build a society where everyone could benefit. And what Piketty basically comes and tells us is that that story was completely wrong, because that was a story that took what was an exception and treated it like it was a general rule. But in fact, that period after World War II was sort of like the blip in history, and now we're sort of back to the way things normally are, which is that capitalism has this inherent tendency to concentrate wealth. Okay, so that is the economic analysis of this book, and now I just saved you from having to read the whole thing if you don't want to. So the last couple chapters is he talks a little bit about what can be done about this. Because remember, he said that it's a tendency. It's a tendency, but it's not inevitable. Before I do that, I thought maybe we could take a few minutes, and I'm going to check on the time. Take a few minutes and just at this point see if there are any questions, comments, thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was Kennedy said, Kennedy said that rising tide lifts all boats, except those tied to the dock.
Yeah, and what's interesting is what Piketty is saying is that Kennedy was even wrong about that. That you don't have to be tied to the dock to not be lifted by the tide. Piketty is saying that, again, like Kuznets, Kennedy was living in a time that was the exception to the general rule, and in fact, Piketty's arguing that Kennedy's wrong. A rising tide doesn't lift all boats unless you specifically have interventions in place to make sure of that. It's the who cares question. Who cares question. I mean, Piketty is very, very concerned about this trend. And, you know, conservative economists and people coming from a more conservative ideological position would say, even if this is true, who cares? I mean, who cares? I mean, people still have more stuff than they used to have, so who cares about these vast inequalities? And I think what Piketty points out is that having these vast economic inequalities is incredibly destructive to the social fabric. So, unlike Marx, who basically said the only way you can solve this problem is to overthrow the system, he's a reformist. He's a reformist. He's not a revolutionary. He's not advocating that capitalism be abolished, but he's basically arguing for government interventions to ensure that wealth and income are more adequately distributed to everyone. And you can think of all sorts of ways of doing that. A progressive income tax, for example, is a way of doing that. If you tax people who have more income and wealth at a higher level and a higher rate, and then use that money on things that benefit everyone, that's a way you can counter the natural tendency. He's a big fan, for example, of inheritance taxes. Because he's very, very concerned, particularly with the degree to which this concentrated wealth is passed from generation to generation. And so that inherited wealth has this tendency to become even more concentrated. And so he's a fan of inheritance taxes. He calls for a progressive wealth tax. He says a progressive wealth tax is even more important than a progressive income tax because you have to directly counter the tendency of concentrated wealth to grow. But where I would pull in the issue of labor unions is there are also other things that the state can do, the government can do, to try to spread the wealth around. The ability of workers to engage in collective bargaining isn't just based on whether workers want to do it or not. It's based on the public policy environment. In the absence of government laws and government regulations that encourage and protect and support employees' ability to bargain collectively, it's extraordinarily hard for workers to successfully organize a union. Very, very hard. The growth in unions in this country was sparked largely in 1935, when in the depths of the Great Depression, the Congress passed something called the Wagner Act that basically said if workers want to unionize, their employer is required by law to recognize them and bargain in good faith, and if the employer doesn't bargain in good faith, we're going to bring a hammer down on them. That law was helped take unions from a marginal force in the American economy to a powerful force in the American economy. And ever since the 1950s, unions in this country have been in decline to at the point where unions right now are at their weakest point, probably, no, not, I'd say in over a century. And part of that was that the Wagner Act of 1935 was gutted by something called the Taft-Hartley Act in 1948, I think it was. And a whole series of other public policies and appointments to the boards that regulate collective bargaining. And so that's like a perfect example that state policy can encourage practices that distribute wealth and income, or it can undermine them. And the challenging thing is that a lot of these policies are very intricate and arcane, and very few people understand how labor regulation and collective bargaining regulation works. So when these changes are made, most people don't even know or care because it's so technical that the implications just escape people. I mean, just based on my own knowledge, traditionally the Scandinavian countries have been quite successful in putting in place policies that distribute the benefits of capitalism more widely. Historically, Germany since World War II was more along those lines. Part of the argument he's making is that every country, including those that were exemplary, it's beginning to unravel because there's this tendency that's always pushing against those policies. And then I would add one thing that he doesn't talk about that much that I would add to it is that I think one of the destructive tendencies of this is that as wealth becomes concentrated, it also distorts our political system. And this is where you get into the catch-22. If the only way you can counter the tendency towards concentrated wealth is through government policy, which is what he's arguing, then it becomes more difficult to maintain those government policies and expand them as wealth becomes more concentrated. Because no matter how hard we try, as wealth becomes more concentrated, that wealth will have more impact on public policy, and which would bring us back to what just happened in the Senate on Friday, when a bill that virtually every technical experts said will be highly destructive and that is overwhelmingly unpopular with the public was approved through the United States Senate, and its advocates even sort of admitted, in some cases on the record, that the only reason they did it is that their donors will cut off the money if they didn't pass it. The book is his economic analysis, and then in the end he says the reason we should care is it will unravel the social fabric. And to me, that's that we can see the evidence of that before our eyes. Because I mean, the more conservative economists take the position that as long as people's levels of material consumption are expanding, everyone's doing better. But I think we all know that levels of material consumption are not the only things people need to have a secure, dignified life, right? We need institutions that provide us with some dignity, some security. I mean, and you can see how this concentrated wealth, it's unraveling our public schools, it's unraveling our healthcare system, it's unraveling all the institutions that provide people with some security and dignity in their lives. That just like we want to base discussions about concentrated wealth on data, shouldn't we also base conversations about the disruption to the social fabric on data? And I would say, well, of course, and that's where we have folks like sociologists and other scholars, and I would say even, not even, good journalism fulfills that role as well. But we also, even in our own lives, can look at the data of what we see going on in our own community. So data comes in multiple forms. So that's why I shared some of the data about what's happening in Duluth. And an important part of data that I don't think we can ignore is building real human relationships with people who are on the losing end of this problem so we can actually see firsthand what it does to them and their lives. I was raised kind of as a New Deal Democrat. That's the way I grew up. That's kind of the way I looked at the world. I mean, the Social Security system, unemployment insurance, the right to bargain collectively, progressive taxation. I mean, that's the kind of stuff he's talking about that is needed to combat this trend. I think the thing that I didn't fully appreciate growing up was the number one, the extent to which it went much further in other countries than it went here. So, we kind of got the cut rate version of a social welfare state compared, say, to Scandinavia or even Canada, right? So we got the cut rate version of the New Deal here. And I didn't fully appreciate that growing up. And the other thing that I didn't appreciate growing up that really this book brought home and other work of other researchers have brought home is that, growing up, I couldn't ever imagine that stuff would be undone. I was just like, it's so obvious that was necessary that I couldn't imagine there would come a time when all of that stuff would be undone and unraveled. And to me, the most troubling part of everything we're living through right now in this country is we are right now this close to having all of it unraveled. All of it. Not just parts of it, but all of it unraveled. And this bill that just passed the Senate, which is not yet law, it still has to go through a conference committee and be revoted by the House and the Senate, so, it's not a done deal. Some of the folks in Washington are already talking about, well, now that we've ballooned the deficit through this bill, the next step is to start targeting Medicare and Social Security. They're just saying that openly. I mean, even 15 years ago, no one in Washington would have openly said that because they knew there would have been an electoral consequence for it. But the corrupting influence of money in our politics has reached the point where policymakers actually feel empowered to say things that in previous years would have been the electoral kiss of death because that's where the campaign contributions are. And it is frightening. And I'll just add one other thing at the tax bill, maybe as a final note to bring it back to Piketty. So the argument for this tax bill is we got to give a huge tax cut to corporations because then corporations will invest that money productively. One of the points Piketty makes, and other economists have made this point, is that there is no lack of capital waiting to be invested. Wealth has become so concentrated in this country and in the world that people with wealth and capital can't find productive places to invest it. I mean, corporations are sitting on huge piles of cash. People with wealth are sitting on huge, savings accounts. They're desperate to find some way to invest it to get a greater return. But there's nothing to invest it in that's going to be profitable for corporations. I mean, there are here and there, but the amount of concentrated wealth outstrips the ability to invest it productively right now in this country and in the world. And so now we're going to give a tax break so that corporations will have more wealth that they can't invest productively. And they've already said, and you can hear this, and this they're already talking about, you know what they're going to do with this tax break? They're going to buy back stock, and they're going to increase dividend payments. That's where most of this corporate tax break is going to go. Stock buybacks and increases in dividends. And what does that do? That increases the rate of return on investment income, because buying back stocks and increasing dividends doesn't do a thing to create a productive economy. All it does is increase the rate of return on investment, increases investment income, and intensifies the very problem that this book is pointing out. And it looks like we're running out of time.
It's getting close to 11:30, and we trust a professor to turn this from a talk into a discussion. That's fantastic. We're done. You can talk afterwards. 11:30, we've had lots of chance to chat and share our views, and thank you so much for coming down and being with us.